There is a question that most people never stop to ask. How does a country that is 80% Hindu, a civilization that predates Islam by 2,000 years, become the nation that Saudi Arabia calls its brother? Look at the airport in New Delhi or Riyadh. You will see a Hindu prime minister and the crown prince of the Muslim world meeting not with cold diplomatic distance, but with a genuine hug. The proof of this relationship is now written in stone on the soil of Abu Dhabi. A massive Hindu temple stands there today, built not in secret, but with the pride and ceremony of the Emirati ruler himself. Finding the answer to how this happened requires going back 5,000 years, to a coastline in what is now Kerala. Around 3000 BCE, the port of Muziris was already the center of a global trade. Arab traders from Yemen and Oman arrived here with every monsoon wind, precisely as they had for as long as anyone could remember. They came for the Malabar Coast's most valuable exports: pepper, cinnamon, and the incense woods that burned on temple altars from Mesopotamia to Egypt. In exchange, these sailors brought the war horses that Hindu kings needed for their armies, alongside frankincense and dates. Many of these traders eventually settled on the coast, marrying local women and building a permanent presence. For 3,000 years, the people of the subcontinent and the Arabian Peninsula shared warehouses, financed each other's voyages, and attended each other's festivals. This was a civilizational embrace that happened before the word India or Arabia even existed. This long history of commercial partnership produced the Cheraman Juma Mosque in 629 CE, built while the Prophet Muhammad was still alive. The mosque exists because Arab traders who had converted to the new faith asked their Hindu hosts, the Zamorin of Calicut, for permission to build a place of worship. The Hindu king said yes. This highlights a vital distinction. While northern India's experience with Islam was defined by the violent land-based conquests of Central Asian and Afghan dynasties, the experience in the south was defined by the Gulf. The Omani sailor and the Kerala merchant were partners, never conquerors. This grassroots mutual respect between coastal peoples formed an unshakable trust that statecraft could never replicate. This organic network functioned for 30 centuries, until the British East India Company arrived in the 1600s and dismantled the architecture of the Indian Ocean. British interests required total control of the waves. Indian merchants were excluded from the direct maritime trade they had conducted for millennia. The direct connection between ancient partners was severed. European borders turned these neighbors into subordinates, routing their relationship through London. Top-down imperial power temporarily broke a connection that had survived since the Bronze Age. When India gained independence in 1947, Saudi Arabia and Egypt were among the first to offer diplomatic recognition. It was a reunion, but one that soon hit an ideological wall. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's vision for foreign policy was the non-aligned movement. He sought to lead the developing world by positioning India above the Cold War. Nehru built strong ties with secular Arab nationalists, like Egypt's Nasser, but he consistently dismissed the Gulf monarchies. To a secular socialist government, these kingdoms seemed ideologically backward, a strategic miscalculation that would take decades to correct. For years, official statecraft failed to engage with the actual partners who had sustained the relationship for 3,000 years. But while the governments were stalled, the people began to move on their own. The turning point came in 1973. The Arab-Israeli War triggered an oil embargo that caused global prices to quadruple overnight. The Gulf states suddenly possessed the wealth to build modern nations, but they lacked the people to build them. They needed millions of workers to construct the cities, hospitals, and airports appearing in the desert. This explosion of wealth created a vacuum that a grassroots movement of people rose to fill. A human tide began moving from India's southern states across the Arabian Sea. Millions of young men took flights to Kuwait, Dubai, and Riyadh. These workers became the backbone of the modern Gulf, pouring concrete and running hospitals. By 2020, over half of India's massive global diaspora was living in the Gulf states. The capital flowing back transformed India in return. This chart shows the surge in remittances that built houses and schools across Kerala, entirely shaping the state's modern economy. For the millions who traveled, working in the Gulf felt like the modern restoration of a family business that had been running for 30 centuries. The profound alliance we see today is built on a cellular memory of trade and partnership. Empires drew lines on maps and politicians drafted treaties, but the everyday movement of people eventually overpowered them all. Human geography, in the long run, is more powerful than any treaty. In September 1969, the heads of state of the Muslim world gathered around this table in Rabat, Morocco. It was the founding summit of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, and a massive moment for global Islamic solidarity. India, which held the world's second-largest Muslim population at the time, was invited by the host. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi dispatched an official Indian delegation to attend. They arrived and took their seats. And then Pakistan's president, General Yahya Khan, delivered an ultimatum. He told the hosts that if the Indian delegation remained in the room, Pakistan and its allies would immediately walk out. Pakistan spent weeks lobbying every Islamic government it could reach, arguing that a predominantly Hindu nation had no place in a gathering defined by religious solidarity. By painting India as an adversary to the faith, they turned a bilateral dispute into a test of loyalty for the entire Muslim world. Caught between his duties as host and Pakistan's threat, King Hassan asked the Indian delegation to leave. They flew home. Pakistan had successfully deployed a geopolitical trap, and India was entirely locked out of the Middle East. For the next 30 years, India's relationship with the Gulf remained strictly transactional. Millions of Indian workers were welcomed as labor to build infrastructure, but the Indian state itself was kept at arm's length. Look at how the Cold War map settled. India leaned heavily toward the Soviet Union. The Gulf states, meanwhile, were firmly anchored to the United States. Pakistan stepped easily into this geopolitical gap. Sharing a deep ideological alignment with Saudi Arabia, the two nations funneled American funding to support the Afghan Mujahideen resistance. During this prolonged geopolitical era, Pakistan decisively won. They engineer the reality where they were the undisputed bridge to South Asia, making India's isolation from the Gulf feel permanent. That reality held until August 1990, when Saddam Hussein's military poured across the border and occupied Kuwait. It was an existential shock that shattered the geopolitical status quo. The neighboring Gulf states were terrified. Suddenly facing the prospect of total invasion, they scrambled to figure out which of their international partners could actually provide tangible support when survival was on the line. India broke from its usual non-aligned ambiguity immediately. The government unequivocally condemned the Iraqi invasion and aligned itself directly with UN Security Council resolutions. But it was their physical response that proved the point. In the chaos of the war zone, India mounted one of history's largest civilian airlifts, safely evacuating over 170,000 of its nationals in barely 2 weeks. Pakistan, conversely, did not mobilize government planes to extract its citizens under fire. They offered ideological support, but lacked the capacity for high-risk, immediate physical action. The Gulf monarchs noticed the difference between words and results. In a moment of genuine crisis, India demonstrated the kind of logistical competence and reliability that ideological alliances simply couldn't replace. By the late 1990s, Pakistan's geopolitical weapon exposed its fatal flaw. The extremist networks they funded to fight the Soviets began to metastasize, expanding far beyond any government's control. The attacks of September 11th were the catastrophic detonation of the very ideological ecosystem that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia had built. The aftermath brought a chilling demographic realization. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. Facing severe international backlash, the Gulf states urgently needed to reorient themselves globally. They had to prove beyond any doubt that they were not sponsors of global terrorism. Pakistan had been playing a double game, simultaneously aiding America while sheltering terrorist organizations. Overnight, they became a glaring liability to Gulf states desperate to repair their global image. For decades, India had warned the Gulf about the dangers of cross-border terrorism. Now, the Gulf understood exactly what India meant through their own visceral experience. Pakistan's strategy had consumed itself. By weaponizing radical ideology to isolate their rival, they ended up alienating the very allies they originally set out to monopolize. By the mid-2000s, India's economy was growing at nearly 9% This quiet, decades-long reorientation finally collided with history at the 2019 OIC Foreign Ministers meeting in Abu Dhabi. 50 years after being expelled from Morocco, India was invited back. They didn't return to apologize. They walked in as the official guest of honor. Pakistan panicked. Resorting to their old playbook, they deployed the exact same threat they used in 1969. They promised to boycott the summit entirely if India was allowed inside. The UAE, now India's closest Arab partner, delivered a polite but brutal response. They noted Pakistan's objection, firmly disregarded it, and proceeded with India inside. The exact ultimatum that gave Pakistan total control a half-century prior was completely ignored. Their geopolitical leverage was gone. 50 years of systematic, deliberate attempts to shut India out of the Muslim world had ultimately crumbled into dust. In the end, the religious leverage Pakistan once held was replaced by a strategic partnership based on market reality. India neutralized a decades-old trap through patience, economic weight, and the quiet power of undeniable capability. In August 2015, Narendra Modi walked down the steps of his aircraft and onto the tarmac at Dubai International Airport. Waiting at the foot of the steps was Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. He wasn't in a reception hall or at a formal ceremony. He was on the pavement, receiving the Indian Prime Minister like a family member. This embrace between a Hindu leader and a Muslim monarch was broadcast across the Arab world. It signaled that the terms of the relationship between India and the UAE were shifting. That same evening, 55,000 members of the Indian diaspora gathered at the Dubai Cricket Stadium. It was the largest crowd ever assembled for an Indian leader outside of India. The roar from the fans could be heard a kilometer away. For decades, these workers felt their presence was defined solely by the remittances they sent home. By addressing them as India's ambassadors, Modi linked the dignity of the diaspora directly to the state's diplomatic mission. For years, India approached the Gulf from a defensive posture. The engagement was largely transactional. India traded workers for oil and managed perceptions to keep the Gulf states silent on the issue of Kashmir. But inside the Gulf, a transformation was beginning. The UAE was diversifying its economy away from oil, and Saudi Arabia was launching Vision 2030, a plan to build a post-petroleum state that required new global partners. India offered exactly what these states needed for their transition: a massive consumer market, a dominant IT industry, and a significant pharmaceutical sector. By positioning India as an equal partner in these internal modernizations, Modi changed the leverage of the relationship. He wasn't there to ask for favors. He was there to offer the resources the Gulf needed for its own survival. This shift moved the dynamic away from a simple dependency on energy toward a balanced partnership built on future economic goals. This strategy was accelerated by a pragmatic bond between Modi and MBZ. Both were leaders focused on long-term results rather than ideology, looking to transition their respective economies into a new era of global trade. The relationship with Saudi Arabia faced a more complex test. In February 2019, 40 Indian soldiers were killed in a terrorist attack in Pulwama by a militant group based in Pakistan. When Mohammed bin Salman visited India immediately after the attack, Modi broke protocol by meeting him at the airport with a hug. It was a visual signal that the personal warmth between the two leaders superseded the usual formalities of diplomacy. In the joint statement that followed, the two countries issued a direct condemnation of cross-border terrorism. It was the first time Saudi Arabia had used such specific language regarding militant groups attacking India. When the Saudi Crown Prince left India, he flew straight back to Riyadh rather than continuing to Pakistan as originally expected. These gestures signaled that India's relationship with the Gulf was no longer viewed through the prism of Pakistan, allowing the two nations to build a direct political connection. This trust led to a sudden acceleration in economic integration. Trade negotiations that typically take years were suddenly moving at an aggressive pace. The Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement between India and the UAE was signed in precisely 88 days, the fastest in India's history. The deal eliminated duties on 90% of Indian goods. By 2023, bilateral trade reached $85 billion, making the UAE India's third largest partner. In Saudi Arabia, the scale was even larger. MBS pledged $100 billion in investment for India, while Saudi Aramco signed a deal for a stake in Reliance Industries, valued at $75 billion. India's strategic petroleum reserves began to be filled with Saudi crude under long-term contracts, turning a historic energy vulnerability into a partnership. In 2023, the two countries signed an agreement to settle bilateral trade in their own local currencies, the rupee and the dirham. Trading without an intermediary currency like the US dollar is a statement of strategic autonomy, showing that the two nations now rely directly on each other's financial stability. On Valentine's Day 2024, Narendra Modi inaugurated a white marble temple in Abu Dhabi. It was built from 20,000 tons of stone, shipped from India in 700 individual containers. The BAPS Hindu Mandir stands on 27 acres of land gifted by Mohammed bin Zayed. It is the largest Hindu temple in the Middle East, built in a Muslim-majority state with the active encouragement of its ruler. This level of institutional support for a Hindu religious site within an Islamic state is a development without a historical parallel. Modi described the temple as a monument to the friendship between two ancient civilizations, noting that the bond between the two nations was now deep enough to host each other's most significant cultural symbols. This building stands as the physical evidence of a decade of diplomacy, a shift from a transactional trade of oil for labor to a partnership that is now visible in the desert landscape. In September 2023, leaders from the United States, Europe, and the Middle East gathered inside the Bharat Mandapam Convention Center for a meeting that would have seemed like political fiction just a decade earlier. At this summit, the coalition announced a massive infrastructure project, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC. This network connects 3 continents through some of the most geopolitically complex territory on Earth. It links Mumbai to Dubai, crosses the Saudi desert by rail, and reaches the Mediterranean at Haifa, backed by undersea cables and pipelines. While the physical scale is impressive, the real shift is the coalition itself. India and Saudi Arabia are now the primary co-anchors of a trade route backed by every major Western democracy. This agreement marks India's transition into a central partner for the Arab world, forming the strategic spine of a new global trade architecture. Beyond the trade corridor, a second multilateral structure emerged in 2022. The I2U2 group brought together India, Israel, the UAE, and the United States. This cooperation was made possible by the 2020 Abraham Accords. These accords established formal diplomatic ties between Israel and the UAE, removing a barrier that had defined the region for generations. For decades, it was assumed that a nation had to choose between being friends with Arab states or being friends with Israel. India ignored that assumption, maintaining deep strategic partnerships with both sides at the same time. This left Pakistan in a difficult position. For 50 years, its foreign policy relied on using Islamic solidarity to isolate India. Now they were watching their traditional allies prioritize pragmatic partnerships with New Delhi. Pakistan's strategy failed because it was built for a Middle East that no longer operates on the old logic of identity politics. For half a century, Pakistan used the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to pass resolution after resolution condemning India over the territory of Kashmir. The ultimate test for India's new Arab alliances came in August 2019. The Modi government revoked the special status of Jammu and Kashmir, integrating it directly into the Indian constitutional framework. Pakistan immediately reached out to its Gulf allies, demanding they join in a unified condemnation of India's move. Instead, the Gulf states stayed largely silent. Saudi Arabia issued a neutral call for dialogue, and the UAE offered no criticism at all. Shortly after, the UAE hosted an OIC meeting and invited India to attend as a guest of honor. It was a direct rejection of Pakistan's attempt to exclude them. The math had changed. Gulf leaders decided that $85 billion in trade and a long-term strategic partnership with India were worth more than the political value of backing Pakistan's religious appeals. These diplomatic shifts are built on a human foundation. Over the last 50 years, 8 million Indians moved to the Gulf states to live and work. Among them was Raju Thomas. In 1981, he left a village in Kerala for a construction site in Dubai with nothing but 200 rupees and a contact address. Raju spent 35 years working as a laborer and supervisor. His career, and millions like it, provided the skilled labor that physically built the modern growth of the UAE. In 2018, catastrophic floods devastated Kerala. In response, Indian workers in the Gulf immediately raised $60,000 in relief funds to send back home. Seeing this, the ruler of Dubai personally contributed 700 million rupees to the effort. He recognized that the people of Kerala were a vital part of the Dubai community. This massive contribution showed that the relationship had moved beyond standard foreign aid. The UAE leadership responded to the disaster as if it were happening to their own citizens. That human trust now fuels a massive economic engine. The UAE is India's third-largest trading partner, and Saudi Arabia is its fourth-largest, with bilateral trade reaching $85 billion annually. In 2023, the two regions removed the need for US dollar conversions in their daily trade. By using India's UPI system, merchants in the UAE can accept digital payments directly in rupees and dirhams. This integration is visible in the physical landscape. Alongside the first Indian Institute of Technology campus in Abu Dhabi stands the BAPS Hindu Temple, a symbol of long-term cultural trust. Looking ahead to 2040, the nature of this partnership will continue to evolve. Raju Thomas's granddaughter won't go to the Gulf as a laborer, but as a professional in a post-oil economy built on technology and finance. This partnership is actually a return to form. 5,000 years ago, wooden dhows carried pepper from India to the Middle East, establishing a route that has existed since antiquity. The last 50 years of identity politics were a brief interruption. Driven by human connection and shared economic goals, a 5,000-year-old civilizational bond has simply resumed its natural state.